From an iron-fisted regime, a treacherous attempt at making history, and a deeply tragic accident, today's video covers 3 photos with dark backstories. Hi, I'm Orikat and welcome to my channel. I deliver cases to you in the dramatisation format, so if that's something you enjoy, make sure to like, comment and subscribe. As always, my aim is to give a voice to the victims and remember them as they were. So with that, let us begin. In the spring of 1989, Beijing, China was alive with the hum of possibility and a new future. Thousands of voices echoed through Tiananmen Square. It was meant to be a time of hope, where young students dared to dream of a future where their opinions mattered. But this dream was about to be shattered in the most brutal way possible. Now, as for the events leading up to these changes, the Chinese government were going through a lot of alterations. The ruling Communist Party started allowing private companies and foreign investment. Leader Deng Xiaoping hoped to boost the economy and raise living standards. However, all this change brought was further corruption. The Communist Party was quickly becoming divided by those who wanted to bring forth new change and hardliners who wanted to keep the regime the same way it was. Now, the catalyst of this whole movement was the death of Hu Yaobang, the same year of the protests. He was a former Communist Party leader known for his reformist views. He was one of the main individuals to have overseen the economic and political changes. He had been pushed out of a top position in the party by political opponents 2 years earlier. And when he passed on the 15th of April, in which thousands attended his funeral, it was an event that sparked pro-democracy protests. Students from across China flocked to Beijing. They were demanding political reform and greater freedom in a state that was feeling increasingly suffocating. A lot of the individuals taking part in the protests were those who had lived abroad or those who had experienced a higher standard of living. For weeks, the protests grew in intensity, and thousands of students went on hunger strikes, desperate for the government to just do something. But despite the peaceful nature of these protests, the Chinese government saw these demonstrations as a direct challenge to their authority and a threat to national stability. At first, the government took no direct action against the protesters. A lot of them were disagreeing on how to go about handling the situation. Some were backing concessions, whereas others wanted to take a more hardline approach. The hardliners won the debate, and in the last 2 weeks of May, martial law was declared in Beijing. Martial law is when the military takes control of normal civilian functions of government, usually during times of emergency, war, or civil unrest. Features of this include curfews, military checkpoints, and restricted movement of citizens. This enforcement of martial law eventually sparked loads of other protests all over China, and the night of the 3rd of June 1989 was marked by an eerie calm. The students, weary but still resolute, were camped out in Tiananmen Square, unaware that their protest was about to become the scene of unimaginable horror. As darkness fell, the rumble of tanks began to fill the streets, and the People's Liberation Army, under orders to clear the square, unleashed a night of terror that would forever be etched into the people's memories. In a mercurial, cold-blooded way, without any warning, the army opened fire on protesters and started running them over with their tanks. And by the time the 4th of June came into full swing, the once vibrant sight of the banners and tents were replaced with the haunting desolation of destruction. But for a lot of the protesters, the nightmare didn't end with dawn. Many of the lead protesters faced arrest and persecution. Others fled into exile, their dreams of change crushed with an iron fist. A particular famous picture of the tanks is known as the Tank Man. In the picture, the man faces a line of tanks heading away from the square. He was carrying 2 shopping bags at the time and was filmed blocking the tanks from moving past. Fortunately, he was pulled out of the way by 2 other men, but no one knows what happened to him afterwards. After the government got the protest to settle down, at the end of June 1989, the Chinese government announced that 200 civilians and several security personnel had died during the protests. Though in 2017, newly released UK documents from a then British ambassador to China, Sir Alan Donald, said that around 10,000 civilians had actually died during the Tiananmen tragedy. A dark part of China's history, it's a topic still incredibly sensitive to talk about over there. Posts relating to the massacre at the protests are moved from social media at the government's behest. This is most likely so they can't go viral. For a younger generation that didn't live through the protests, there is little awareness over what happened, though they can choose to seek out information on it if they wish. This photo shows the peaceful protests the day of the massacre. This next story takes place in Paris on February the 4th, 1912. The air was bitter cold, at -7 degrees, and the crowd had gathered at the base of the Eiffel Tower. They had all arrived to witness what Franz Reichelt promised would be a revolutionary moment in aviation history. But instead, they would watch a man's obsession lead him to his death. Franz hadn't always been chasing dreams of flight. An Austrian-born tailor, who'd made Paris his home, had built a respectable business. He made dresses and suits for the city's elite, but as the age of aviation dawned, all his focus began to centre around one particular ideal. Using his skills, he believed that he could create a suit which could then change into a parachute, which would inevitably stop pilots falling to their death. Between 1910 to 1912, Franz poured his heart, his soul, and all his savings into this invention. His workshop became a laboratory of silk and rubber as he tested all these different designs. Initial experiments from lower heights had all failed, but Franz was determined to continue. He just believed he had to persist, and if, say, he got to test it from a higher height, then that would be all he needed to show that his invention worked. So Franz finally got permission to test his device at the Eiffel Tower. He had led officials to assume that he was using a test dummy, but Franz unfortunately had other plans. More specifically, a silk suit that made him look more like a bat than a bird, with its wing-like folds and rubber lining. And whilst he was up there with his friends and officials, they spent nearly 45 minutes trying to talk him down, begging him to reconsider what was starting to look like utter madness. But Franz was resolute. He could not be told otherwise. Because he truly believed in his invention, he believed in his own skills and his ability to succeed. So above all the panicked voices, Franz shouted, "I want to try the experiment myself. I want to prove the worth of my invention." In a last-ditch effort, one of his closest friends came forward and just pleaded with him to step down. He could stop this and just use the test dummy. No one would think any less of him. But again, Franz says, "I have absolutely complete faith in my invention. I'll be back for lunch." As the clock ticked at 8:22 a.m, Franz climbed onto the guardrail of the first platform, 187 feet above the frozen ground. Those on the platform with him looked on in horror, and those on the ground held in breaths as they saw him get ready to jump. The newsreel's cameras just flicked on, and there was just this hushed silence that went over everyone in the area. Like they were on a knife's edge, the crowd stood there for a tense long moment. And Franz was kinda just standing there, slightly swaying in the winter wind. For a split second, it was thought he might back out of it after all. but then he crossed his arms and jumped straight off the Eiffel Tower. As he fell, the suit was supposed to bloom into this life-saving canopy, yet all it did was wrap around him like a shroud as he fell to his death. And so the crowd just started screaming because there was no impressive aviation display of a parachute, just Franz free-falling and then hitting onto the frozen ground at the bottom. In fact, he slammed down with such force that he made a 6-inch deep indent in the soil. His death would go on to become one of the earliest recorded deaths on film. The tragedy of Franz's story isn't just his death, but also the dogged determination that led him there. He was so convinced of his invention's potential, he ignored all the evidence to the contrary. So the flying tailor never made it to lunch that day. Instead, he left behind a tale about the fine line between bravery and recklessness. His death will forever be preserved on film and is a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous beliefs are the ones we hold about ourselves. In current time, modern base jumpers leap from the same spot where Franz met his end. Their advanced parachutes are testament to how far we've actually come in aviation technology. But the difference is, they jump with equipment tested by science, not just faith alone. This photo shows Franz falling to his death. It was just another sunny afternoon in Ypres when 7-year-old Arthur Emmanuel Bittencourt was doing what kids do best, playing, exploring and finding adventure in the most unexpected places. And during the first week of August, he spotted something that caught his eye, this big mountain of white powder by the roadside. To him it looked like some type of sandbox or playground. But what happened next would shake his family and the community to the core, serving as a reminder how quickly childhood curiosity can turn into tragedy. Arthur embodied a typical Brazilian boy, full of life and mischief. He always wanted to have fun and goof around. The 3rd of August 2023 was no exception. Now, where he lived, Ipiranga, was a quiet town in southern Brazil's Parana region. It was a very tight-knit, helpful community. And so, on that fateful Thursday, Arthur was out and about on his family's property. He came across a white mound of powder, and it just looked so enticing to jump into. Fluffy and voluminous, the stuff would go absolutely everywhere. So at first, Arthur ran forward laughing, asking someone to take his photo next to the big pile. His father did as requested, and Arthur gave a cheeky double thumbs up to the camera, his smile radiating pure joy. Afterwards, Arthur then took the opportunity to jump straight into the middle of the white mound. Tragically, the thumbs up photo would become the last ever photo taken of him. Now, as Arthur wiped the dusty substance off his clothes and kind of climbed out of the pile, what his family didn't realise at the time was that sitting on the road was not harmless powder. The aftermath was swift and devastating. Arthur began choking on the cloud of dust he had left behind. And seeing his pain beginning to mount up and seeing how he was struggling to breathe, his family now knew something was seriously wrong. They rushed Arthur to the nearest hospital, praying he would be okay. But despite the medical team's best efforts, it was too late. The white particles had done irreversible damage, and Arthur was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the community and beyond, and consequently, Brazil's civil police opened an investigation, planning to speak with the Bittencourt family about the circumstances that led to this preventable loss. You see, questions arose about why such a dangerous substance was so easily accessible, and why there weren't any proper hazard signs around it. because though it looks like a seemingly innocent building material, powdered limestone is extremely lethal when inhaled. It has high carcinogenic potential and will damage the lungs. Usually the material requires protective gloves, goggles, and a face shield to even be handled, let alone jumped in. And so naturally Arthur's family said they had no knowledge of the dangers associated with limestone, especially once it's been ground to a powder. In the area they lived in, limestone powder was commonly used for construction by farmers to enrich soil and increase crop yields. So it seemed it perhaps could be negligence on the builder's part, just leaving the mound easily accessible without any warnings. Arthur's uncle, weighed down by inconsolable grief, would later confirm that the cause of Arthur's death had indeed been limestone poisoning. His family were at loss for words and cursed with the heavy burden of hindsight. It's a cruel irony that something as ordinary as limestone powder, which is used as a construction material across the world, could be so damaging if someone comes into contact with it. In the wake of Arthur's death, local authorities were pushing for stricter regulations regarding the storage and handling of construction materials. This photo shows Arthur's final moments, happy and unaware of what was to come. Childish delight turned into a heartbreaking reminder of how quickly things can change. Thank you for watching this video. Comment down below what the saddest photo was to you.